All right, good morning. All right. Well, good morning and welcome to our series on the wilderness, our Lenten series for this year. My name is Brennan and I'll be your guide over the next few weeks. Thanks for being here, and I'll open us in prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for today. We thank you for the blessing that you've given us of this time and this space to consider how you are at work in our world, how you are at work in our lives. Help us to notice those places where you are encouraging us to grow, encouraging us to learn, encouraging us to transform, to become every day more and more the kind of people that you are asking us to be in this world. People who are full of your spirit, people who are propelled by your energy to spread grace, to preach the good news, and to bring all that we are, all that we have, into your service. Amen. All right, well, again, we have our Lenten series. Lent, a period of kind of introspection, a time of preparation for that series, the season of Easter. So on Easter Sunday, we start, of course, the long season of Easter, one of the longest liturgical seasons we've got here in the Christian calendar. And to prepare for that big season, that big mystery, we've got what today's show called Mark Wahlberg's 40-Day Challenge, which I really love that's how they interpreted his message about following Lent. I think he was on Ash Wednesday last year. And so you might call it Lent, you might call it Mark Wahlberg's 40-Day Challenge, but either way, Lent is a time that is marked for 40 days because the number 40 it appears many times in the Bible as a time of transformation, a time sometimes of difficulty, of living through a difficult period. That number 40 tends to signify kind of like a round number that this is a long time. So 40 days, 40 nights, or 40 years. These are not taken to be literal days. That is to mean it means like a long time. So there are many of the judges in the book of Judges that are said to have ruled Israel for 40 years. And in a way, they're just saying it was a long time, a generation, right? So wandering in the wilderness for 40 years or spending 40 days and 40 nights somewhere, like Jesus spends 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness, or Elijah spent 40 days and 40 nights traveling to the mountain of Sinai. These really are like an idiomatic way to say just a long time. So Lent might feel like it lasts a long time, especially for folks who take on some sort of special obedience or some sort of giving up something for Lent, by the way, a way to test ourselves. Now, when I say that word test, that might suggest to us being tested like a math test, like back in high school or something, which I know is everyone's favorite activity, is taking a math test in high school. But I give tests all the time. As an educator, I teach Hebrew at school every year at Columbia Seminary, and learning an ancient language can be pretty tricky. It requires tests. That is to say, I have weekly grammar and weekly vocabulary quizzes for my students, many of whom say, why do we have to do this? This is ridiculous. This feels like punishment to us. And the reason, right, is it's not that I'm trying to trick them. It's not that I'm trying to be mean. It's not that I'm trying to be nasty. The thing is that repeated periods of testing or accountability in a way can help people to grow in what they're doing. But I try to remind my students at the beginning of a semester, there's two different mindsets, right? You all have heard this before, right? There's the fixed mindset, which is you're either good or bad at something, that you either can do something or you can't do something. This is how a lot of us approach skills in life, right? Either I'm good at art or I'm bad at art, or I'm good at music or I'm bad at music. And there's another way to think, and that's the growth mindset. And that growth mindset is that everyone can learn just about anything, given some time, some dedication, some attempts, right? And some accountability. That is to say, if I ask you, hey, can you learn this musical instrument? You might say, no, I can't. But the truth is, any of us could learn any musical instrument if we put some time in. For some of us, it might be a bit easier. For some of us, it might be a bit harder. But these are human skills. These are things that can be learned. And the biggest difference between people who can learn things and people who can't is not innate ability, it's their attitude. Can I change? Can I grow? So I try to remind my students that every quiz I give is not a chance for me to get mad at them or to judge them or think little of them or something like that. Every single quiz I give is an opportunity to be honest with ourselves about where we are and how but a chance also to see how we've grown. That is to say, these are chances to check in, to see what's going on in our lives and in our hearts and in our minds. And Lent, for many people, is this opportunity to check in. And we associate the period of Lent with this testing that Jesus has in the wilderness. We'll get back to that the last week on Palm Sunday. We'll talk about Jesus' testing in the wilderness from his perspective and in the Gospels. But for now, we're going to talk about how this idea of testing is itself a biblical tradition that goes way back. So Jesus' 40 days actually references this experience that Israel has in the wilderness many times over. So just to remind ourselves about this wilderness, right? This is our theme. We talked about wilderness not being like Americans, contemporary Americans tend to think of wilderness, at least us on the East Coast, for folks in the Midwest or whatever, even in the Pacific Northwest, we tend to think of wilderness as this lush space with lots of rain, like we had this last week here in Georgia, right? I don't know about you, but my basement was flooded on, Tuesday night? Whatever, yeah, it was crazy. So all to say that these spaces that we think of as national wilderness spaces are spaces with lots of trees and lots of growth, and they happen to just be wild, kind of untamed, right? But also, if we're visiting them, they probably have bathrooms at the entrance and a parking lot, and they probably have some trails and a ranger that you can call at some point, right? If we think about wilderness in the Bible, this word really means desert, abandoned desert wastelands, right? There's nothing in these spaces. So when we read in the Bible about wilderness spaces, they're not talking about spaces with lots of animals in them, lots of trees in them, spaces with lots of access to water that just don't happen to have cities there. No, these are spaces in that part of the world where there's very, very little rain, very little water, very little growth, very little life. And these spaces are vast and rugged. So this is an image of the wilderness of Sin or sin. It's just a kind of happenstance of English language that the wilderness of Sin happens to have the same letters as the word sin. It doesn't mean sin. It means the moon. Sin is the ancient Hebrew word for the moon. It was also the word for the moon god for many of the peoples who lived around Israel, Sin. But so this is the wilderness of the moon. It's kind of like a moonscape, a landscape almost like the moon. And this right here is the Mitzpah Ramon crater. Not really a crater, nothing fell there. It's a particular kind of canyon formation. It's just rocks that have eroded at different levels, at different rates, so that it formed this kind of Grand Canyon sort of space. But this is pretty typical of this area of the wilderness of Sin. If you just go south of Jerusalem for a couple hours in a car, you hit this space. This is part of the Negev desert, which is this difficult space to move around. So there are some canyon areas like that I just showed you that you could imagine walking for many miles, but most of this space, for as far as you can see, is really difficult to traverse. On a couple of days a year, there are torrential rains in these parts of the world, and these 2 days of torrential rain at most form these incredible floods, and these erode the particular kinds of rock and soil that you have in this part of the world into these very steep canyons. So these are steep canyons with no water at the bottom. They're called wadis. This is another name for them, it's an Arabic word, but there's other words in ancient languages to describe these things, but they are deeply cut canyons into the rock. These spaces, except for those 2 days a year, and when those 2 days a year of rain occur, basically the soil can't take that much water, so almost all the water just runs away somewhere, right? It just runs either towards the ocean or towards the Jordan Valley and goes into the Dead Sea. So you have kind of just this huge amount of water flow, but very little capacity to soak up any of the water. So this area is lacking in water. So you need you need a bunch of rain to grow barley, which is the most drought-resistant crop that you can find in the ancient world. You need about 17 inches of rain a year to have a reliable barley crop. The area that we're talking about, the Judean wilderness to the east of Jerusalem, but then also going all the way south to the Red Sea, that whole area receives less than 3 inches of rain a year. And again, all on 2 days. So this massive downpour of rain, and then it's just all gone. So this area is lacking in water. This area, because it has so little water, has few travelers, either animals or humans. What humans do live there and what animals do live there are really knowledgeable about how to move around, right? So we've got these camels, right, that have developed ways to store their fat in particular locations, right, on these 2 humps so that they don't burn up with heat. I mean, it's crazy. Even the kind of like goats and sheep that we have in this part of the world actually look pretty strange to us. It looks like they got really big butts because they have all their fat stored just right behind their rear so that they can evaporate heat more easily elsewhere in their body. So that is to say, the animals of this region are shaped differently just to survive. And we have limited settlement. There's just very few people who actually can settle in these areas, especially in the ancient world. Today, people can live in these areas where you pump water in, basically, right? I mean, you can live in the middle of nowhere in Arizona and you have a Home Depot down the street, but you can't do that in the ancient world, right? There's no grocery store, there's no building store. So people who tend to live in these areas, they move around in the ancient world and the modern world. They are mobile folks. Bedouin, that's what we call these folks today. And here's a Bedouin tent. We imagine that a lot of these tent folks, this is kind of how they lived in the ancient world too. And Yahweh, the God of Israel, is said to have lived in a tent for a long time. In fact, when David tells his prophet Nathan that he really wants to build a house for Yahweh that is a palace, or a temple is another way to say this. So a temple was just a big house dedicated to a god. It was the exact same word for a royal palace and for a temple. It's just a house. And the Holy of Holies was just the most set apart room. It was the bedroom, the special chamber that was set apart for your God. So David says to Nathan, hey, God's been living in a tent. He says in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verse 2, the king said to the prophet Nathan, see, I'm living in a house of cedar, but the ark of God, this mobile throne of God, stays in a tent. And Nathan said to the king, well, go, do what you have in mind. He knows you can go build a house for God. That's great. But that same night, God came to Nathan and said, hey, I didn't say that. God says, go tell my servant David, thus says the Lord, are you going to build me a house to live in? And then God says, I have not lived in a house since the day I brought up the people of Israel from Egypt to this day. I've been moving about in a tent and a tabernacle, that is a mobile tent structure. God likes camping. God says, wherever I have moved around the people of Israel, did I ever say a word with any of the tribal leaders saying, why have you not built me a nice house, a house of cedar? Now, therefore, so then God says, I'm going to build you a house, a royal house, David, but I don't want a house from you. I like to move around. I pointed out last week that this is a highly unusual thing for a god in the ancient world to have been said to say, right? That is to say, in ancient Egypt, they had stories about the gods talking about their houses. They like nice houses. They want big houses. They want them in big cities because they want food. The idea in the ancient world is that gods need food to live. That's why you bring your harvest to the temple. Wherever you are, if you're in Egypt, if you're in Canaan, you're in Mesopotamia, you bring your harvest to the temple so the gods can eat. The idea is they need food to survive. In ancient Israel, they say, actually, we don't think our God needs food to survive. Our God likes the smells from the altar. God likes barbecue smell, but that's all God needs is just the smell. But elsewhere, God is said to have needed food, right? So the gods like to live, according to these ancient folks, when they write stories about their gods like to live in these big, fancy cities where there's big, fancy buildings and nice structures, nice furniture in the temple, and they have attendants who wait on them all the time, and they get reliable, really nice food. This is what the gods are said to really like. So, in ancient Israel, when they tell people, our God likes to live in the wilderness, and our God likes to move around in a tent, that's actually how our God prefers to be, they are assumed to be a little crazy. This is not normal, and your God must be bizarre. And there's other things, too, that make their God seem bizarre. But Yahweh seems to like desert spaces, which is itself strange. Another thing that's strange about this in the ancient world is that when you thought about wilderness spaces, if you were in Egypt or you were in Mesopotamia, you were in Babylon, let's say, or if you were even in Jerusalem in a nice big city, these desert spaces would not be marked on a map. So today we have very clear lines that demarcate every nation on earth, right? And they go sometimes through desert spaces. Or we have lines between the states in the United States. So the line between Nevada and Utah is not lush, right? Nevertheless, it's a line. It's drawn on a map. Everyone knows where the border between Utah and Nevada is. And if something bad happens on one side of the border, the federal agents can know which state it happened in, whatever. All to say that in the ancient world, no one had this sense of very strict demarcated lines between these areas. There were no clear lines between Egypt and Israel in the ancient world. Why? Because no one cared to draw that line or maintain it. That is to say, your territory ended with your last habitable area. And in ancient Israel, if you went south of this area around Beersheba, there was just nothing there. And if you moved south past Gaza in the ancient world, there was not enough rain to survive. So there was just this big gap of empty space between ancient Egypt and between the land of Canaan. The land occupied by the Philistines, the land occupied by Israel, land occupied by the Phoenicians. All these folks lived, and there was a gap there, and no one drew a line because no one cared to draw a line, and no one cared to rule this space. So these spaces actually lacked borders and lacked rulers and lacked rules. This was seen as a dangerous thing, so the Jericho Road went through a wilderness space between Jericho, which was in an oasis in the Jordan Valley, and Jerusalem. So anyone taking the Jericho Road was going through this wilderness space, which was not patrolled. It was not controlled by, nobody really wanted to control this space, even if though it was a highway between these two cities. So imagine going out, not just between two major cities, but out in the middle of nowhere. There's no one there. No one cares to rule this space, but it also means it's an opportunity. So in the ancient world, there were actually people, not just ancient Israel, but we know of lots of people who fled to the wilderness from time to time to avoid what they saw as oppressive power. So in 1 Samuel 22, David runs away because Saul is chasing him. When Saul chases David, it says in 1 Samuel 22, David escaped to the cave of Adullam, which is out in the wilderness in Judea. And when his brothers and his father's house heard of it, they went down there to him. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, and everyone who was discontented gathered to David, and he became captain over them. That is to say, David got this little army of people who went to the wilderness because they were in debt and didn't like Saul, and so then David had a little army. But nonetheless, you can see these folks are running away to the wilderness because they're in distress, because they can't pay back their money and they're worried and so on. And this is a space of refuge in a way. This wilderness area is deadly, and yet it provides an opportunity for folks to change. And this wilderness then was a land of chaos. Now, chaos is not pure evil, but it is a lack of order and structure. Chaos is opportunity for change and transformation, and it's also dangerous. It can be death. And this wilderness space was both in the ancient imagination, a space of opportunity and a space of potential disaster. In contrast to that, we had these cities, right? Like Memphis in Egypt, these major cities that symbolize order and power. Jerusalem was one of these. And then we had rulers who lived in these spaces, and their order was expressed and felt as violent in order to keep order. And that order created oppression. Here we have an image of ancient enslaved peoples being forced to make bricks. I don't know if you've heard this story before, but this is what we're going to be talking about today, is Exodus. So in the Exodus story, right, in that book of Exodus, we hear about Pharaoh becoming scared. There's a new Pharaoh who is born who doesn't know Joseph and doesn't understand Joseph's people, and so becomes scared that these weird desert folk are going to take over Pharaoh's nice community. And so he oppresses them, and he tries to enslave them, and he succeeds and creates a structure of oppression. And it's in this context that Moses, who has murdered someone, right, he is kind of in between being an Egyptian and a Hebrew, he runs away to the wilderness, and there goes beyond the wilderness, like we saw 2 weeks ago in chapter 3, beyond the wilderness, and there he met God. That is to say that God, like we heard about in 2 Samuel 7 with Nathan talking to David, God tends to live in these wilderness spaces, these desolate, isolated spaces, which would have been incredibly suspicious to any ancient person and was incredibly suspicious to Pharaoh. Because when Moses comes back and tells Pharaoh in chapter 5, you got to let my people go because we worship a wilderness God and we need to go out in the wilderness to worship our God or we're going to receive pestilence. Pharaoh says, oh no, what did y'all get mixed up with, right? I told you to stay away from those bad people, right? These Hebrews are people who live in wilderness spaces. Even back to Abraham and Sarah, they choose to live in wilderness spaces even when they're in the land of Canaan. They like these wilderness spaces. They're like modern Bedouin. They live in tents, they move around. And because of this, Pharaoh sees Moses and his people as suspicious. The wilderness space was a space of chaos and, in divine terms, was understood to be a place of demons. Demons lived in the wilderness. We can even see the assumption of this in Jesus when he goes into the wilderness to be tempted. It's a space that's really run by the devil, and that demons are out there trying to get Jesus, right? It's also a space where there's angelic powers that come to save. That is to say, it's a space of like God's presence and evil presence. And Pharaoh assumes that Yahweh, this God of Moses and Aaron, is evil because Yahweh is trying to overturn the major cities and the major spaces of Egypt, which Pharaoh, of course, thinks is good, right? Pharaoh thinks that Pharaoh is good and that Egypt is good, and that Yahweh is a trickster God. Yahweh's a little bit like Loki in the Thor stories, right? Kind of out to like overturn the system, flip the tables, like, just out there to like mess with stuff. Maybe a little bit like people understood Jesus during Holy Week. Well, of course, we know this story, right, of the plagues. Maybe you saw it in Prince of Egypt or read about it in the Bible. But nonetheless, that God comes in power and shows and demonstrates through plagues, right, that Moses and Aaron represent the God who is actually in power over creation. This is the God who created the world. This is the God who's in charge of all of creation and can undo creation too. This God of the wilderness is a space of creation and is the God of a space of disorder, of deconstruction, of dismantling. And so the structure of Pharaoh's Egypt is itself susceptible to God unbuilding. God for a long time says, you need to let my people go because this is a system built on oppression. This can't continue. God loves these people and will do anything to save them. And God gives lots of chances to Pharaoh. And sometimes we hear that Yahweh hardens Pharaoh's heart. And sometimes we hear that Pharaoh hardens his own heart. That is to say that there are many chances throughout the story for Pharaoh to just say, fine, go. But eventually God says, I want to show Egypt and I want to show all the nations that I'm the God who has the power over life and death. The God that has the power over order and disorder. The God who has power over creation and uncreation. And then also God says, I want Israel to trust me. And I want these Hebrew people to trust me, that I am the God who I say I am. And eventually God has this bizarre scheme to lure the Egyptian army to get trapped in the water. Maybe someday else we'll do a whole study on Exodus and we'll spend some time looking at the different versions of this story. There's a few different versions of this story that tell it from different angles that are kind of combined in different ways in the Bible. We don't have time to go into all of this now, but just to see that God takes this people and leads them out into the wilderness first. So in chapter 14 of Exodus, God says, tell the Israelites to turn back and camp in front of Pi-Hahiroth between Migdol and the sea in front of Baal-Zephon. And Pharaoh will say of the Israelites, they are wandering aimlessly in the land and the wilderness is closed in on them. It's kind of like it's a pretend maneuver, right? That is to say that the Israelites turn around and they pretend to wander around a bit right near the sea so that Pharaoh imagines that they're lost in the wilderness, that the wilderness is kind of swallowed them. They got kind of wandering around and they're defenseless. Now notice that Yahweh is using the wilderness as a place to kind of protect them in a way, and a place to kind of succor the overly confident Pharaoh to show up with his armies. And then, of course, God takes Pharaoh's army and tosses them into the water, or makes walls of water and makes them fall on them. Both of them are here in Exodus 14, but we'll get to that another time. Nonetheless, Yahweh leads them out And it's said that Yahweh leads them out into the wilderness. So in chapter 15, Moses and Miriam sing songs of praise about what God has done at the ocean, at the water. And then in chapter 15, verse 22, Moses ordered Israel to set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. And here's that wilderness wandering section. Now, in the ancient world, you can see this is a map let's see if I can point. You can see there's a map of Sinai here. This is Egypt to the left. You can see the Nile Delta, which is very fertile with the waters of the Nile. And you can see the Nile Valley that continues south of there. The habitable parts of Egypt look like a flower a little bit. And then to the east of that, you see there's wilderness space. And then you can get up to the area that's occupied by Gaza in the lower left of what would be Israel. And you can see it's kind of in the center top of that map. And there's a little bit of green there. You all see that at the very top of the map in the center. There's a little bit of green that pops up there, slight green. That's Gaza, which was an area that got a little bit of rainfall from the coast. So that was habitable. You could get there. So, and if you notice, right at the very kind of top of the Sinai Peninsula, there is this bit of green. That's Pelusium. It's on the Mediterranean coast. So you can see from the Nile Delta, you go east a little bit, and you can actually follow this like little thin band of green. There was nice water that came in off the Mediterranean coast, and so you could actually get from Egypt. And it was said that the Hebrews were being enslaved in the Nile Delta area. So they could have gone just along the seacoast all the way up to Philistia, and they probably could have gotten there just fine, actually pretty quickly. And in fact, they could have gotten there with nice water supplies and food supplies the whole way. Now, why in the world do we read about all this wandering in the wilderness instead of just getting on a highway and going straight up to the promised land? Well, this is an interesting question, and it's answered by God to Moses in chapter 13 of Exodus. So right before the Red Sea crossing, they're coming to the Red Sea, or Reed Sea. The Hebrew actually says Yam Suf, Sea of Reeds, which we don't know where this is. It's an anonymous body of water. A lot of bodies of water were called Yam Suf, or Sea of Reeds. It was only first translated as Red Sea in the early modern period. This is Wycliffe translated it this way. So that's one of the early English translators. But we don't know where this is. In fact, it's a strangely kind of anonymous body of water. Nonetheless, chapter 13, verse 17, when Pharaoh let the people go. So at first Pharaoh lets them go, then he recants, turns back, chases them with the chariots, but first he lets them go. When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, although that was nearer. So that is to say, they chose not to do this highway here. And you can see these are ancient maps of highways. You can see there's a highway that runs along Pelusium that goes along the Mediterranean coast. It goes right to Philistia. That was a nice highway. It says that God chose not to bring them that way, even though it was nearer and it was safer in terms of water and food supplies. For God thought, if the people face war, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. If they went that way, they would go through lots of towns. They would go through lots of cities. They would eventually go through the kingdom of the Philistines. And those Philistines might look at them and say, okay, here's some easy pickings. We'll enslave these people again. Or, we'll take it. So that is to say, God didn't want them to have immediate conflict. So God chooses to avoid the Philistines by leading them the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea, or the Sea of Reeds. So God chooses to take them this roundabout way to go kind of south, it seems, through this wilderness space. And you can see there's another road, perhaps, a thin black line that goes kind of through the wilderness. And there's other black lines that kind of move further south in other maps we might see some kind of more dense networks of trade. Sinai had a whole bunch of stuff there. There was a lot of mining that went on. These were kind of isolated mining encampments that ancient Egypt had to get precious metals, to get some gold, some precious stones. But so there was like a thin network of roads that they might be able to move on through these spaces, but still very difficult to survive. But nonetheless, God says, I'm going to take you this way. And so then verse 21 of Exodus 13, God went in front of them. The Lord Yahweh went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them along the way, and a pillar of fire by night, in order to help them travel this way. So they start to go this difficult way. And then, of course, they cross across the water. Which water, we don't know. There's a whole bunch of little bodies of water at the edge of the Nile Delta. one of those probably, or perhaps the Red Sea. We have no idea. The Gulf of Suez, who knows? But they decide not to go by this Via Maris, or this way of the sea, and instead they go kind of south through Sinai. And we know they go through Kadesh Barnea. That's mentioned a bunch in the Bible in a bunch of different accounts. So they wander around in the wilderness of Sinai, and then they end up coming up to the southern wilderness area in Israel, which would be the Negev, and in the ancient world was often associated with the people of Edom. We talked about last week how there's these strange stories in the Bible about how Yahweh comes from Edom and comes from Teman. Here's Timnah or Teman down there in southern Edom, and the area of Petra, which is built much later than this period that we're talking about now, but is that same kind of area of that red stone, that beautiful and forbidding place in what's now southwest Jordan, but then would have been considered to be the Edomite area, or the area of Midian, same place. This is where Moses would have come across God. This is where God is said to live, in these spaces. So, once they get into this area, this repeated thing happens. And this might not be what we expect. So God has delivered this people who were enslaved, who were oppressed, who were told that they were nothing, and then God delivers them into this land. Not a nice land of milk and honey yet. Delivers them into a land of nothingness, of utter wasteland. So, verse 23 of chapter 15, they get into this area. Moses gets Israel to go out in the Red Sea area, and they went out into the wilderness of Shur, and they went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Now, Moses had said to Pharaoh, God wants us to go out 3 days into the wilderness to celebrate a festival. Well, they go 3 days out in the wilderness, and there's nothing. They couldn't even drink the water of this place they came to called Mara, because they couldn't, it was bitter. Oops. So we start to see this bitter water, Mara. Mara is the word for bitter. And the people complain against Moses. Now, there are some places where there's water that comes out of springs, but it's the minerals there that leach into the water that come out of these springs are so harsh that they're not drinkable, right? It's not potable water. So you might drink it and then you might get sick later. It has it's alkaline or something, or it's too acidic, or it's got all this mineral stuff in it. That is to say, people might drink this thinking, oh my God, I'm dying of thirst, I need water, and then they might really regret it later. So these bitter or waters that make them sick are coming out of the rock. And so it says Moses responds to the people. The people say, hey, what are we supposed to drink? What are we supposed to drink? Why did God bring us out there? And it says they complained. This is that murmuring tradition that we see. So this idea, here we go. Yeah, this tradition of murmuring, that people murmur in the wilderness. They get really mad, right? They grumble. Here we got some cartoons that I found of people, the top one is like Moses leading the people, and are we there yet? And I have to pee, like he's on a road trip with kids. And the bottom one there, the people say, oh, we're so hungry. At least in Egypt we had food, which is something they do say. Maybe we shouldn't have left Egypt, grumble, grumble. And Moses says in this comic, do not despair, Israelites, for God is, grumble, grumble, grumble. And then all the people go grumbling against Moses, and their stomach is rumbling. They're just mad, right? These are ungrateful children. Oh my gosh, I can't believe it. In Christian reading, the people often write here like, oh my God, can you believe it? These people don't trust God. What terrible, terrible people. Ugh, they grumble and they murmur and they're just like complaining like a kid complains in a car trip about having to pee. Think about it like this. They were going 3 days in the wilderness and had no water. Have you spent 3 days without water ever? And imagine doing that walking through a wilderness, a desert space. Can you imagine starting in Sedona and walking 3 days south of there and just not having any water on you? Right, how would you feel, right? I feel like within 2 hours, all of us would be really upset. So 3 days with no water, they're facing the possibility of death. They really might die. And so then they cry out. And it says Moses cried out to Yahweh. Here, in these stories, this is not perceived as being bad. There are later stories where Israel grumbles, complains, moans about stuff, and God says, no, that's not good. But here, in these stories, what do? They bring their complaints to God, and they cry out. And this is seen to be a really important word. This is the same word that Abel's blood does. It cries out of the ground. This is the same word in the beginning of the Exodus story where the Israelites cried out from their oppressions. And it says that God heard and that God responded. And here again, we see that God responds. So the people cry out to Moses. Moses cries out to Yahweh, and Yahweh immediately showed him, it says a piece of wood in the NRSV. The word is tree, eitz. God showed him a big tree, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. So at this place of bitter water, all of a sudden the water became sweet when God showed Moses a big tree to throw in there. The idea is that this is some sort of test, and later on this is said to be testing. Again, not testing in the sense of, I'm going to give you a math quiz, just to, fulfill some sort of state mandate or something, right? This is an idea of helping the Israelites have a growth mindset. So, Israelites have been enslaved in Egypt for a long time, for hundreds of years. They have developed particular mentalities, particular expectations about themselves, but also about God, or the God that they worship. They have different ways of thinking about how the world actually works. And for them, they need to grow. They need to change. There needs to be some time where they realize that Pharaoh actually isn't in control of the world, that they can trust this God who has recently saved them, but also that they are stronger and tougher people than they might think that they are. And God gives them this space, this wilderness space for them to grow. Instead of leading them directly to the Philistines who would have just subjugated them again, instead of trying to maybe make them just kings of Egypt right away or something, God realizes that these people need to change and need to grow. And this is the way God decides to do it, by asking them to come with God on this wilderness journey. So God then brings them to another place, Elim, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they camped by the water. And here's the oasis that some people would imagine might be the Elim oasis. We have no idea where, but nonetheless, this is kind of in history. People have suggested this might be Elim from ancient times. But anyway, this is one of those types of oases. You show up in this area, and all of a sudden there's a spring, there's some water, there's some growing stuff, there's some food, there's some animals there, and you might be able to survive. And then pretty much immediately the people come out into the wilderness again. Says chapter 16 of Exodus, verse 1, the whole congregation of the Israelites set out from Elim. And just to realize, these oases that we come across in the wilderness, they are not permanent. We are temporary, right? Temporary wanderers through wilderness spaces. You find these places of rest, but it's always important to continue to set out. And here the Israelites set out again, and they come to the wilderness of Sin, or Sin. This is what I showed you at the beginning, that image of the Mitzpeh Ramon crater. They come to this area of the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Sinai, or Sinai in Hebrew, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from Egypt. And the whole congregation of the Israelites complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. And the Israelites said, hey, if we had only died by the hand of Yahweh in the land of Egypt when we sat by our flesh pots, which means just big pots of meat. We had meat there, right? And we ate our fill of bread, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill the whole assembly with hunger. So they start to accuse Moses and Aaron of just giving them a worse way to die than they had in Egypt. At least in Egypt we had food, right? We were enslaved, our lives were terrible, but we at least had food. But here now you've taken us in the wilderness to kill us. And then Yahweh said to Moses, now notice this is in response to the people complaining and grumbling. In other words, it's okay to grumble and complain. God can take it, but if we direct it, right? Can we direct our grumbling and complaining in a way and asking God to do something? And then Yahweh said to Moses, okay, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. There's going to be a flood of bread from heaven. And each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them. So here's a test. The bread is not just sustenance. It is sustenance in the Moses, but it's also a test. That is to say, again, it's a way for Israel to grow. It's a way for them to see, to be accountable to God, like, where am I on my growth journey? And in a way, am I ready to trust God in a new place? Once Israel gets a kingdom, once they get a land, once they get a nice space with lots of power and food and the potential to build a giant army, are they going to trust God then? So this is a way to help Israel grow to become the kind of people who perhaps can be the kind of covenant community that God is going to use to transform the world. But they have to find a way to change first. So God says, here's the test, or growth opportunity, right? Whether they will follow my instruction or not. So on the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much to gather on those days. The whole point of this is that every day you're going to go out, and Moses gives these instructions. You're going to go out and don't gather a whole lot of this stuff. There's basically little flakes of bread on the ground that apparently taste really good. It tastes like coriander with honey. I don't know. Yeah, spicy honey. It's great. It's really good tasting stuff that's going to fill you up and make you feel satisfied. You're going to go out in the morning and gather this stuff up. And Moses says, don't gather up a ton of it. Gather just what you need for the day. Moses gives them a warning and says, if you gather too much, it's going to rot. It's going to go get nasty. Don't try to store it up for the next day. Instead, just take what God gives you for this day. And then he says, by the way, if you don't have the ability to gather very much, you're going to notice that there's a whole lot there for you. There's enough for you. And so the people go out, and of course some gather too much. They spend all day gathering this stuff and hoarding it away and stuffing it away. And apparently they go back to camp and there's just enough for one day for them in their hands. They said, wait, I spent all day gathering this stuff, but it just turned into just enough for one day. And then maybe they go out and gather some more and they try to stuff it away and keep it. And the next day they wake up and it's all rotted and there's maggots in it and stuff. And, Moses says, see, I told you so. But then there's also some people who go out and don't have enough ability or power or they don't have enough ability in many different ways probably to gather up enough. And it says that those people got back to their tent and they looked down and they had enough, just enough for that day. So this is to say that there's a trust issue here. The people are supposed to trust that God is giving them what they need every day. In verse 12 of chapter 16 of Exodus, God says, thus you shall know that I am Yahweh your God. So the whole point of this is that it's supposed to help the people understand and grow into the belief, the trust that God actually is going to give you what Jesus later called your daily bread. This is exactly what Jesus is referring to in the Lord's Prayer. Give us this day our daily bread. This is what he means. So it's not just sustenance, but it's also giving us this sense that what we have is enough for today, but also giving us the sense that we aren't supposed to go out and grab as much as we absolutely can, and also that there are some around us who might need the community to help them have their daily bread. So give us our daily bread. It has all these lessons in it together. And then when the people actually see this stuff, it says in verse 14, it was like a frost on the ground. What is this stuff historically? We have no idea. It's flaky, miracle bread, whatever. People said, well, maybe it was like grasshopper poop, and I don't know. We don't know what this stuff is. And in verse 14, the layer of dew lifted. There was a substance, flaky substance like frost on the ground. Verse 15, when the Israelites saw it, they said to each other, what is it? Which in Hebrew is manhu, which is where we get manna from. Manhu. What is it? Man means what, and hu means it. So manhu. What is this stuff? So the name of this stuff is, what is it? They didn't know what it was. Moses said, well, it's that bread that God gave you to eat, which doesn't help you know what it's, what's the nutrition label, right? This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much as you need. An omer, or like basically 2 liters per person, according to the number of all the persons. And Israel did so. Some of them gathered too much, some of them gathered too little, but nonetheless, everyone had enough. And some people tried to store some away for the next day, but it bred worms and was nasty the next day. And then it melted over the course of the day too. So there was just enough. You had to every day hope that there was just enough and trust eventually that there was just enough for you. And then on the 7th day, they had to rest and they had to not collect the manna. And Moses said, on the 6th day, collect twice as much. And on that day, and that day only, you can store extra manna. And then that'll be enough. And again, this is a test in a way that they had to learn to rest. Now, resting was not a thing in the ancient world. There's no day off in ancient Egypt. There's no sense that there was a day off. They didn't have a day of rest in ancient Egypt. They didn't have, there were festival days, I guess, every so often, but it's not clear that people didn't work at all on those days. Especially enslaved people did not have a day off every day of the week. But this is a strange thing to claim that there was a day where everyone and everything, even the land, even the animals, had to rest, had to be given rest. So here we're told that this idea that people actually had to trust, this would have been a really radical thing, to trust that there's going to be enough food, especially with a day of rest, with a day that we tell God and our neighbor that I don't have to do anything today, except just trust God. It's an exercise. It's an opportunity for growth. It's a test. And every week, we get the opportunity to see how we feel about Sabbath. So this manna, manhu, or man, is what it's called as well. Man, manna, that's where we get that from, is that Hebrew word man, which means what. This what is it stuff is itself an opportunity for Israel to grow. And over 40 years, they continue to have this stuff every morning, so that when they get to the land, the idea is that when they start to grow their own crops, start to pull water out of the ground, that they realize that all of this stuff that we have every single day, everything we get, even the air we breathe, is a radical, gracious gift from God. That every moment that we have every ray of sunlight that hits us, every time we see another human being, that this is a radical gift from God. And the idea is that every single thing in our lives is fully dependent upon God's grace at every moment. And this is something that it's hard for us to learn and hard for us to remember. Because we often think, I did this, or maybe we did this, a certain group of us did this, right? Say this is all about us. That we are in charge of our lives, we are in charge of the world, we are in charge of this church, we're in charge of this denomination, we're in charge of this town. This is a chance for us to not give up responsibility, but a chance for us to, at every moment, radically give grace and thanks to God. So, we talked about water, this provision of water. In chapter 17, they come back into the wilderness of Sin, and they go by stages. That it means that they're moving little bit by little bit, and there was no water for people to drink. And the people said, hey, give us water to drink. And Moses said, hey, why are you quarreling with me? Like, why are you getting mad at me? Why do you test the Lord? You know, that's to say, like, you know that God's going to give us water. At this point, this happened a couple times, but the people thirsted, and they complained, and they said, why did you bring us out of Egypt to kill us and our children with thirst? And so then Moses cried out to Yahweh. And it's at this point that Yahweh does something. Again, reminding us that you might be in a wilderness space. When you're in the wilderness space, it's okay to cry out to God. It's okay to not just cry like sad tears, but it's okay to say to God what Moses says, which is, what am I supposed to do? What in the world? Help us. Like, aren't you supposed to be here? Aren't you supposed to care for us? Ancient Israel does this all the time. I talked last week at Montreat about the Psalms, which actually are surprising to us about how much they tell us to get angry at God. They're like, if you get angry at God, that's fine. God can handle it. God's big enough to handle your anger. The thing God wants you to do is to be honest and to actually like ask God or talk to God, like communicate with God. That's the important thing. If you're angry, if you're sad, if you're disappointed, tell God that and be honest. Don't just be like, no, God, I know I shouldn't be angry, or just, I love you, God, you're amazing, and there's this little thing I want to say. No, be honest. Like, bring your full honest self to God. Now, you don't have to show that full, honest self to everyone you meet. You don't have to display it all in community all the time, right? We can try to control ourselves a bit more for the sake of being in goodwill with other people and trying to love others as we love ourselves. But nonetheless, God wants that actual full relationship with you. And here, God says, okay, you finally cried out to me, now I'll do something. So the thirst is in a way trying to get Israel to talk to God, to complain to God, to trust God in that way. It's about trust. If we're in a relationship with someone and we don't tell them what we feel, it's probably because we don't trust them. So, verse 4, Moses cried out to Yahweh, what am I going to do with these people? They're about ready to stone me. And then the Lord said to Moses, okay, go on ahead of the people, take some of the elders, and take your staff and strike the rock. And then there'll be some water, and the people can drink it. And then Moses called that place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites quarreled and tested. Said, is Yahweh with us or not? Now notice, it's not said here to be a bad thing in and of itself. It brought water from the rock. And that water from the rock, of course, is associated with many traditions in Moses' life about, did he do something bad here? We're going to leave that question for now. But we're going to move on to the next chapter, when Jethro comes and talks to Moses. And Moses says, I'm all alone. I'm all alone in responsibility for this community, and I'm tired, and I can't do this all by myself. So it says in chapter 18, verse 13, Moses sat as judge for the people, while the people stood around him from morning till evening. When Moses, his father-in-law, saw that all he was doing for the people, he said, what is this that you're doing for these people? Why do you sit alone while all the people stand around from morning till evening? Moses said, well, because the people have come for me to inquire of God. They have a dispute, they got to come to me, and then I tell them about what God says. Moses' father-in-law said, what you're doing is not good. You will surely wear yourself out, both you and these people with you. For the task is too heavy for you. You cannot do it alone. Now listen to me. I'll give you good counsel, and God will be with you. You should represent the people before God. You should bring the cases before God, teach them instructions and statutes, but also you should look for able people among the whole congregation who fear God, who are trustworthy, who hate dishonest gain, and then set these people as officers of hundreds, thousands, fifties, and tens, and let them sit as judges, and it will be easier for you, and they will bear the burden with you. If you do this, and God so commands you, if God's okay with it, then you will be able to endure, and all these people will be able to go to their homes in peace. The issue here is that Moses thinks he's by himself. And I don't know if you've experienced this in any wilderness spaces that you've been a part of, but wilderness spaces feel lonely. They feel isolated. There's very few people that can move through these spaces. And when we go through wilderness spaces in our lives, like something falls apart in our life, whether it be family or our job or our sense of future or a sense of our past, whether some crisis happens to us and things start to fall apart, those experiences feel incredibly lonely. We often feel like no one's going along the road with us. Even if we're in a marriage, even if we're in a family, even if we have partners in business or something, even if we have people who are close to us, often we feel very distanced and we feel very alone. And Moses was feeling quite like that. And what Jethro said was, you can't do this alone. And that's not the first time we hear that message. When God created the first human, God noticed and said, it's not good that the human should be alone. All the way back in Genesis 2. We need to have companions along the way. And God has created those companions. They're here along with us. Like they're around us. But the question is, do we trust God enough to share our burdens with others? That's a real question. Now, we shouldn't share our burdens with just anyone we meet, right? Or with just everyone, or shout them from the rooftops all the time. That's probably not very constructive. But nonetheless, are there people that you have who you can share your burdens with? There's a survey that's been done every year since the 1950s of American men especially about how many close relationships they have. And a few years ago was the first year that the median, get my statistics right. So if you put all of the numbers, if every American man who names how many close friends he has, you put all those numbers in a row in increasing order, the middle number, the median number, is 0. So most American men have no close relationships that they can share their burdens with. This was the question. How many people can you share your sufferings with? Striking number. We are in a crisis of loneliness, and it's everywhere around us. And some of us are in it right now. And the reason that we exist as this community right here is so that we can help bear each other's burdens. So one of the things that Moses comes across is that this test of the wilderness was really a test to try to help him create and generate the kinds of relationships and bonds that would sustain him not just in the wilderness, but also in those times when they had come into the land. Now, Moses doesn't come into the land, but later generations do. And those generations need to learn the lesson of Moses if they're going to be sustained. So all to say, what we get is a series of different tests or opportunities for learning and growth, as I tell my students. And those series of opportunities of learning and growth include the test or the encouragement to believe and learn that God is the one who provides everything for us, and that God will provide our daily bread. In life and in death, we are God's. This is the lesson of the wilderness. There's also a lesson about order and structure, and Moses being willing to come across new and different ways to think about order and structure. Moses had grown up in Egypt. Of course he thought there was just one king, just one person who judged everything and who had all power and control. That's what he had grown up knowing. And the wilderness was a space where he could meet and come across people like Jethro, who had grown up in wilderness communities. Jethro was a Midianite, one of those wandering people, and in the ancient world, those wandering people actually had much more democratic ways of governing themselves. Wandering desert people don't tend to be monarchical, right? They don't have one strict hierarchy. They tend to have a pretty flat sense of governance, pretty equal, a sense of equality in some way. We know this from different ancient texts and things where there were some ancient kings who got mad at desert people because they like, who do I talk to in charge? There's one king, Zimri Lim of Mari from the year 1800 BC. Hammurabi kills this guy. But Zimri Lim is talking to some desert people and he says, who's in charge? And he writes a letter about how mad he is. He's talking to these desert people that are like raiding his crops or something, and he's trying to like negotiate with them a peace. And he's like, who's in charge? And they say, none of us are in charge. He says, what are you talking? And so he writes this letter to his general where he's like so mad that none of them are in charge. And yet we see here, this is what those ancient people were talking about. This sense that we have to actually trust each other, and we have to work with each other, and none of us can be like the person in charge. You're not in charge. I'm not in charge. God ultimately is in charge. All right, I'll finish with this little story about trust, gratitude, and grace. That when we trust God, we can move into a space of gratitude that is difficult to learn any other way than being put in a position where we have to trust. So this right here, this is southern Israel. This is a picture I took while on a drive. We were going south. This is last May. I was in the car with a friend. We were working on a project together, and we were driving way south into the Negev desert, and we saw this sign for Ein Avdat. Ein means spring. So spring in the desert. And we said, okay, let's go check this place out. And so we park our car at the border of this national park for Ein Avdat. And we got out of the car and we see this, and I'm like, this does not look very welcoming. There's a couple of green shrubs here. This is not. But then you come to the edge of this cliff here. You can't see it really. But you get to the edge and there's this giant canyon that's been carved away by water. And you look down and you can't see water at the bottom of this. And there's this big hike down there. My friend and I hadn't brought much water because, we're modern people in a car and driving to a place that had buildings that had water, running water. So we were thinking, we'll just kind of do this little hike. And we see this and we're like, can we make this, with no water? And we start to hike down. And finally, you get down to this place. This is like a long way down of switchbacks, and it's hot. Like it's May, so it's hot in Israel, and we're sweating like crazy. And we get down there, we can finally start to see some kind of green at the bottom. And we finally get down to the bottom, and all of a sudden, there's this immense, lush river that's just running through this canyon, and it's crazy, like these narrow banks of this river. But finally, you see some trees and some growth and some life. And we actually saw some animals down there, like running around and stuff. I mean, you can imagine actually surviving at the bottom of this Ein Avdat oasis. But you had to trust. And I imagine ancient Israel sometimes was marching down these things trying to find water, and they were not quite sure if there would be water at the bottom of these or not. And it was a question of life and death. And the question really is, who do you trust? Do you trust the signs from the national wilderness zone or whatever that are trying to tell you can keep going down, don't worry, there's water down there? Or are they misdirecting you in a way? Okay, so let me end with this. This is a psalm, Psalm 107, that this sense of trust can also bring us great gratitude. So Psalm 107 is a psalm that's written by people who had been through many difficulties, and they were singing songs of thanksgiving. And it starts out, "Oh, give thanks to Yahweh, for he is good. His steadfast love endures forever. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, those that God has redeemed from trouble and gathered in from all the lands, from the east, the west, the north, and the south. Some of them wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to an inhabited town. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. But then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and God delivered them from their distress. And God led them by a straight way until they reached an inhabited town. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wonderful works to humankind, for he satisfies the thirsty, and the hungry he fills with good things." And then in verse 33, God turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into thirsty ground, a fruitful land even into salty wastes because of the wickedness of its inhabitants. God sometimes takes away water. But then, verse 35, God turns a desert into pools of water and a parched land into springs of water, and there lets the hungry live, and they establish a town to live in. They sow fields and plant vineyards and get a fruitful yield. By God's blessing, they multiply greatly. So we're going to talk about this a little bit next week, that part about wickedness and salty lands and desert wastes. Today we've talked about growth and provision and transformation, and that the wilderness spaces are often spaces that encourage us to grow and to transform, to turn into people we wouldn't have been without these wilderness spaces. And I encourage you to think this week, have you gone through a wilderness space that actually led you to become something more profound, more deep, something more trusting in God? Have you grown in special ways through these wilderness experiences? But next week, we're going to talk about another aspect of the wilderness, and that's something that Jesus confronts in the wilderness, and that's evil and sin and even death. So next week, we'll come back together and we'll talk about the prophets. I'll stick around for questions. If anyone has questions to ask and to answer, you can find me here and so on. And I'll look forward to seeing you all next week on our journey through the wilderness. Amen.